In all the events going on around the spread of pepperpox, there's the human element to it. There's Mears, who finally admits to Cheevers, after it's practically dragged out of her, how awful she feels over Mitch and what happened in Chicago. And then there's Mitch needing to physically intervene to ensure that his daughter's boyfriend doesn't come in and potentially infect her. With his wife and stepson gone, she's pretty much all he has left. Much to her annoyance, no doubt. Having a good rational reason to not do what you want matters about as much to a teenager as the NASDAQ does. The team in Hong Kong is going over the footage and finds when Beth blew on the chips of that Japanese businessman, for luck. Yeah, that worked well. Indicating the likely point when he caught it off of her. Except when Orantes brings it up with the Chinese officials, they shoot down, suggesting that it started here. Yes, China is clamping down to make sure nothing negative is attributed to their country. On the scale of plot twists, where a 10 is Statue of Liberty on Planet of the Apes, this isn't even a 1, which is Michael Ironside is the bad guy. Speaking of plot twists, back in Minnesota, Mears wakes up in the middle of the night with symptoms, and that's not good. Get infected and race the clock to get the cure, that is not an Act 2 development. That's the last 20 minutes, so I think she's about to become a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, poor Mitch is dealing with the problem of trying to have a funeral during an outbreak, although he's having the opposite of the problem that we've all been having. Rather than not being allowed to have people gather, the people can show up, it's the corpses that can't. They're really pushing cremation right now. And what's worse, Mitch has to be the messenger to his mother-in-law, who doesn't want to hear about any problems with this. She wants them buried on the family plot. It finally hits her that the guy trying to sort out this is probably just coming off the worst 2 weeks of his life, and has added, "Find a way to cut through red tape so I can honor my cheating wife" to the list. So she does her best to try to put his mind at ease. But yeah, like some kind of aphrodisiac Beetlejuice, merely mentioning the cheating thing brings it up. We're back in the casino watching her set up her layover in Chicago for her layover in Chicago, as Orantes is tracing the first cases all back to Beth, including the local guy who was working at the casino who collected her glass. But Sun, the contact down here, openly speculates on a secret cure that the French and Americans have got, which he read about on the internet. Of course, everyone knows you shouldn't believe anything on the internet, except, of course, me. But he also mentions that forsythia that Alan had mentioned, how it failed to save his mother, just in case you thought predatory scam artists connected to hedge funds might be a force for good in this world. In fact, we soon see him showing just how low he is prepared to sink, as he posts a video of himself pretending to be sick and taking forsythia to try and treat it. He says he's been taking it for a while, which achieves 2 things. First, for those who take it and die like Sun's mother, it's because they weren't able to last long enough for the medicine to turn things around, so it doesn't debunk it. And in some lucky cases, their own immune system will beat this, and they'll live, so they'll attribute it to the forsythia. Oh, and also point 2, it means you can't just buy one tiny little dose. You need to keep on getting it. You know, you'd have to admire him if it weren't for the fact he's the actual devil. Well, Orantes is about to pay for Alan's greed because on the way, Sun and his co-conspirators kidnap her and bring her to the village, so that he can use her as a hostage to compel the other countries to give them the cure first. To prove the futility of this, the #1 boots-on-the-ground agent dealing with this disease is currently dying on a cot in a gymnasium somewhere. I think if there was a line, this is where the line should probably start. Right now, they're having trouble getting her on a damn plane, actually. Cheever's doing what he can, but Haggerty says that the special plane with the isolation pod is unavailable. It's being used by some congressmen, and after bringing it back to Chicago, it's going to be left on the ground, because the governor is shutting everything down. Even though, as Cheever notes, this won't stop people from leaving Illinois and will wind up creating bigger problems than the one that they're already facing. Case in point, Cheever himself goes to the office and tells his fiancée in Chicago to drive straight to Atlanta immediately and tell nobody, which you can imagine how well that last part goes. Well, the guy who can't be arsed to find his own doctor has overheard the conversation, so that's going to bite Cheever in the ass even worse than a mosquito on the Nile. But yeah, soon there is rioting in San Francisco when there's not enough forsythia at the drugstore, and Mitch and his daughter see panic buying, or possibly looting, it's kind of hard to tell, at the grocery store. But you know what? While we're on this subject, let me just tell you something that irked me. I'm not going to pretend that this is in any way tragic, nor am I trying to downplay any of the tragedy of all of this, but let me just share a personal irritation. Ever since Katrina, I made it a kind of a hobby to be prepared for a disaster. Nothing crazy. I slowly built up over time. I didn't set up a zombie shelter or anything like that. It was more stuff like, what would happen if we were hit by a disaster and everything was shut down for a week or so. So gradually I started getting things together and having supplies of extra things on hand, like canned goods, toiletries, and so on. Like on a prepper scale of 1 to 10, I was maybe a 2 or 2.5, okay? Just to kind of be ready in case any kind of disaster happened. Like you're supposed to be, like the Red Cross tells you to do. Now, near the start of this year, I ran into a sudden, unexpected problem with my Vimeo hosting. And since my livelihood is making videos for the internet, this naturally demanded all of my attention for a little while. Well, that meant that I was not monitoring our emergency supply situation. And so suddenly I find out that we have opened our last package of toilet paper. Well, we're going to have to stock up on that. Only everybody in America had rushed out and bought all the toilet paper. There was not a roll to be found. Oh, I was both shocked and pissed off. You have to understand, for 10 years, I had prepared for the moment when there would be no toilet paper, and that day had arrived, and I was out of frickin' toilet paper. Oh, it was like always wearing a crucifix, and the one day you misplace it is the day you run into a vampire. Again, it's not a tragedy. Nobody died. Nobody was harmed from it, but nevertheless, it still left a scar. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, my wife actually had the chutzpah to tell me to take a package of toilet paper out of the shopping cart because we had enough. And I was like, not one word. No, never again. This will be my 2-ply legacy. Anyway, Mitch is trying to get into Wisconsin, but as with Illinois, Minnesota has now closed its borders. And despite Mitch insisting that it's fine to let them through, the guy with the gun does not seem to be willing to listen. If only we could find something persuasive, like telling him that Mitch's wife is the one who started this whole damn thing. That'd be sure to persuade him to cut some slack. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Mr. Freeze is on the loose because Batman is distracted by the virus. Oh no. No, it's even worse than that. It's Alan. At least Mr. Freeze would just unleash his ice cannon on the Golden Gate Bridge. Alan is passing out flyers for forsythia as a cure while, get this, wearing a hazmat suit. Mr. Freeze would not stoop to that level. Hell, the Joker wouldn't sink to that level. That journalist is waiting on his front stoop, begging for some of the snake oil, and Alan promises that he'll give it to her, with all the sincerity and sympathy of the supervillain that he is. We then immediately jump to the other end of the bell curve, where we find Mears already on death's door, hearing the guy in the next cot is freezing, even though he's already got a blanket because there aren't any more. So, rather than just leaving him with the one blanket that he has, she takes the coat she's covering herself with and tries to give it to him so he has even more to keep warm with. And does she get a fat stack of cash like Alan did for this generosity? No. She dies alone, is wrapped in plastic, and gets dumped in a mass grave. Hope you're having a great Christmas! Meanwhile, Cheever, Sorry, I know I keep calling him Cheevers. I had a student with that name. I keep adding the S out of habit. Meanwhile, Cheever is dealing with protests, especially because of the rumor about sitting on a cure or stockpiling drugs, that kind of crap. We are ways into this thing, weeks. One thing that Contagion does is reflect upon how this is a long journey. It's not something that you get in a typical film where it's all in a condensed time frame of a few days at most. The drama stems from the nature of this kind of crisis. Cheever's, possessive S, interview is about the long nature of this crisis. It's not going to be resolved in a week or a month. It's going to be a long time before we have fully dealt with all the ramifications of this situation. There's no shortcut. There's no cutting to some dramatic and radical solution. We don't have Quint in the back of the room running his nails down a chalkboard announcing that he's going to solve the whole thing. I'll catch this virus for you, Chief, but it ain't going to be easy. Bad bug. But you'll get the gene sequence, the vaccine, the whole damn thing. To contrast with Cheever and his advice about social distancing and hand washing, we have our resident snake oil salesman via satellite. He takes the chance to push for Scythia again, pointing out that the CDC isn't including it on their list, and arguing it's because of a conspiracy between the CDC and Big Pharma, who of course are backed by the fishing industry. Where do you think the idea for cod liver oil came from, huh? Follow the money. Unfortunately, that mosquito has finally landed and bit Cheever on the butt. Alan throws out the call made to Cheever's fiancée as a sign that this whole "we're helping everyone" line is a lot of hogwash. What we have is a game that I like to call Everyone's an Asshole. First, Alan is an asshole for undermining confidence in the efforts to resolve this, when he has first-hand experience with the fact that civilization is breaking down. He's seen the rioting, the shortages, and the lack of basic civil services being conducted, making the situation worse for, and let's be clear, no other reason than to make money. That's beyond reprehensible. You are ultra reprehensible. You are reprehensible in dimensions that only exist mathematically. And Cheever, you're going to be the scapegoat in all of this, but you have it coming. I mean, I absolutely get why he might do that. If your loved one is in peril, you might take action. But the thing of it is, most of the people in Chicago have loved ones. Yes, even in Chicago. And it's not as if Cheever has somehow morally earned his reason to be an exception. It's not as if he's on the front lines here. He's on the exact opposite part of the lines. He's way in the back. It's his agent who is on the front line and is currently in a mass grave. So as much as I might want to sympathize with Cheever because it's Lawrence Fishburne and because we know that he did it because he cares about someone, the fact of the matter is that if you break the rules, you have completely undermined what you are trying to do. You're telling people, do this, it's for the greater good. But I'm not going to do that because it's to my own personal benefit. Nothing undermines the rules faster than ignoring them yourself. As a consequence, it undermines these rules that are for the greater good. Why should I follow social distancing if him and that reporter who is close enough to hit him on the back of the head with a clipboard aren't following social distancing? Why, for that matter, should I listen to what the authorities are saying when it's quite clear the authorities don't care whether I live or die, so I might have to do whatever is necessary to survive, even if it requires violence in the end? Or maybe that Alan and people like him are right, and the CDC is conspiring. I better look for alternative ways to cure that, the things they don't want me to hear. It's a virtual certainty that whatever his motives, people are going to die because Cheever made that mistake. Okay, let's get away from the depressing stuff again for a little while and talk about something positive. There are things to feel good about. There are trends taking place that say tomorrow is going to be better than today. And please note, I'm not just talking about in the United States or in Western nations. I'm talking about the whole world here. Economically, for instance, it's been estimated that 200 years ago, 84% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, and the global population was roughly 1 billion people at this time. Today, despite the number of people in the world increasing by 650%, the percentage of people living in extreme poverty has actually fallen by almost 90%. It's currently 8.6% of the population. This is where the bare midriff thing comes in, because those numbers put that figure into perspective. If I just told you without context that 650 million people live in extreme poverty, that'd probably be a very depressing statistic, wouldn't it? But if you put that into context and see that going from 84% to 8.6% is achievable, then it's easier to see, hey, things are getting better. It's projected that in 10 years, we'll get that figure down to 5%. We have come so far, so fast with all of these things. We're not ready to rest on our laurels, but we can see that we are making serious headway. That's the point to take away. The race isn't over, but we're winning. In fact, it's entirely possible that within our lifetimes, that figure will get down to 0. And this is a case of a rising tide lifting all boats. Everyone is doing better as time goes on. If you compare the buying power those people in the early 19th century had for their money, I'm talking about adjusting for inflation and the cost of things and all of that, then 100 years later, that buying power had almost doubled. Another 100 years to bring us to today, it increases another 7-fold. This is average among all human beings on Earth. In that time, the global illiteracy rate has plummeted from 90% to 10%. More people are attending school. People are attending school for longer periods. And again, we're talking everyone lumped together, rich nation and poor alike. The amusing movie Idiocracy, which I'll be looking at next year, presents a world where we're becoming dumber and dumber. But analysis of IQ tests over time proves that actually, we're getting smarter and smarter. The average IQ is supposed to be 100. But we have to keep adjusting that about 3 points every 10 years because across the board, we're getting smarter. More high-calorie food, better medical care, healthier living conditions, and greater mental stimulation. All of this is helping our brains develop more and more of our potential. That's partially why I brought up the economic stuff. The more money, the more can be invested in the coming generation in all of those aspects. Not just individually, but on a larger scale too. We can debate whether it takes a village to raise a child, but it certainly is easier to raise a healthy child in a healthy village. Access to clean water has exploded, reaching 91% of the human race and growing. And the most humble of human technologies, soap, has helped even the poorest on earth. Children who would have died from disease did not, thanks to bars of soap. Indeed, soap and sanitizer could be considered the unsung heroes of 2020 when you think about it, about how much worse the pandemic could have been without efforts to keep things clean. And all of this, remember, shows us how far we have managed to come. The goal is by 2030 to increase the standard of living to the point where no one on earth will live in extreme poverty and everyone on earth will have access to at least minimal sanitation. That's probably too optimistic of a goal to hit that quickly. But with as far as we have come, it's not an if we can achieve this, it's when will we achieve this. Back to the movie. The effort to find a vaccine is stymied. Dead virus, even with chemicals to boost immune response, just isn't working. So they're going to go with attenuated virus. That is, they're going to weaken it to see if they can work without the virus being able to actually infect someone. If you're not familiar with any of this stuff, I'll break it down for you here. First off, antibiotics won't work. Antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections like strep, but they don't work on viruses like the flu. Think of it kind of like germs are the bad guys in some movie, and they're trying to get into your warehouse to get the Ark of the Covenant or something. Antibiotics are like bringing in the authorities to come in and wipe them all out. Well, viruses are a case where the authorities can't come in and take care of that. It's left to your own security forces to deal with them. And your security forces are your immune system, which respond to the virus with antibodies that hopefully will eventually defeat it. You need to have the right kind of antibody for each virus. Now think of vaccines as being kind of like you're hiring some Navy SEALs to come in and teach your immune system how to deal with the threat. But they have to teach about a specific kind of bad guy. They'll say, here's the new bad guy, let's teach you how to be ready in case any of his friends show up. Now, what they had originally tried to do here was they showed up with a bad guy who was dead. And they wheeled him in there and they told the immune system, here's what the bad guy looks like, here's how you defeat them if any of their friends show up. In this case, that didn't work. So, the attenuated virus means they showed up with a bad guy who was alive, but tied up, to teach the immune system how to deal with that kind of a bad guy. Now, what Hextall is afraid of is because they're developing something brand new, it's entirely possible that when they try this, they might wind up with a bad guy who can slip their ropes and escape and go out and steal the Ark of the Covenant, and then the Nazis win, and no one wants that. So it's going to require some careful testing to see whether or not they can make this work. Now, if you're curious, the vaccine for COVID is neither one of these things. It's a new kind called mRNA, or messenger RNA. In that case, the virus isn't involved at all. In that case, it's kind of like the Navy SEALs are showing up with just a PowerPoint presentation on the bad guy. The bad guy, live or dead, is never brought into your warehouse to train your immune system. You teach without it. So, in this particular case, there's not the remotest chance that you could possibly get COVID from the vaccine because at no time is the virus ever introduced in your body in any form at all. Oh, and nobody is going to microchip you, okay? For starters, the technology is absolutely impossible at this point in time. We're not talking like 10 years from now or anything. We're talking like maybe if the aliens are real kind of technology. Think about the battery, for instance. How long can you keep your phone going, even if it's off, before you have to recharge it? Now imagine the size of the battery that would be on such a tiny microchip. It's not possible, okay? We have nanotechnology the same way that we have hoverboards, in that we have something that has that name, but it doesn't work the way you think it does. So yeah, pepperpox is just plain bad news, and what's worse, the damn thing is mutated. It has an R0 of 4 now, and it has a lethality rate between 25 and 30%, and is projected to infect 1 out of every 12 people, which should be comforting, but I have a tendency to beat the odds on bad things. If we had a national lottery for human sacrifice, I know I'd wind up as a finalist. By day 26 of the first case, things have been reduced to soldiers distributing MREs to people from the backs of trucks. And when they run out, the crowd goes nuts, finally boarding the trucks only to find out that, yeah, it is all gone. Well, don't we look like the jerks here? At home, Mitch witnesses gunshots in the house across the street and guys fleeing the scene. So the next day, he breaks into the house of a neighbor who's long gone and takes their shotgun, just in case. Only, while he's gone, his daughter has slipped out to go hang out with her boyfriend. Man, what is up with that girl? You can't stay out of trouble for the few minutes I'm gone stealing firearms? Stupid kid. Anyway, they're working on the vaccine, but the pressure is high, and there's the concern about time that's going to be lost between finding one that looks like it will work and when we can actually get it out to everyone. So Hextall decides to test the one that worked on the monkey on herself, and then exposes herself to someone who's sick, specifically her father. This selfless act works, only for it to serve in stark contrast to human desperation when, about 6 months into this thing, some hoodlums break into the house where Cheever's fiancée lives. figuring that he just leaves an extremely valuable vaccine lying around like spare change. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. Why don't you go check the hutch? That's where the swear jar is with the cures for Ebola and lupus. That's enough depression. Let's take a break from that. I've talked about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and yet they're not the ones that people currently fear, although that indicates just how far we've come on demolishing them. Now, the one that people fear these days is climate change. Now, sadly, climate change is a politically divisive topic, and I'm not here to spoil the holiday with political issues. So instead, let's talk about tremendous progress being made in zero-carbon electricity production. An important issue since the expansion of hybrid and electric vehicles demands greater access to electricity, after all. It's not much of a benefit if your electric car is powered by coal in the end, is it? Well, there's good news here. The International Energy Agency says that the cost of getting energy from efficient solar photovoltaic is so low that it's producing cheaper electricity per kilowatt hour than anything else. So much so that the expense of infrastructure is going to be the bulk of the cost rather than the power generation itself. In other words, the cost of building the means to generate electricity and get it to your house is more than the cost of generating the electricity once that's finished. I mean, this situation is so odd that it might completely upend the way that we are paying for our electricity going forward. It could require electric companies to go to a service level basis rather than a per use basis. Right now, we pay for electricity kind of like the way we pay for gasoline. The more you use, the more you pay. But in the future, it could be handled like the way most home internet is, which isn't how much data you use, but the maximum speed that you're capped at, your bandwidth allowance that might allow you to get more or less at a time, but you can have as much as you want all day long so long as you don't exceed that bandwidth. That's the way your electricity may work. You can use as much or as little as you want all throughout the day, and your charge will be the same, but you can never draw too much electricity at any one time. And not to worry, technological advancements as well as a greater use of zero-carbon energy sources have put to rest the worry that solar panels were making more pollution than they were solving. No, these days the only downside to the solar potential is the amount of space that's required for it, and the fact that the sun isn't always shining. So it would need to be supplemented the rest of the time. But even then, there are zero-carbon options available. Nuclear power is one of them. Now, contrary to some misconceptions, nuclear power does not contribute at all to climate change. While it might be asserted that nuclear energy is a political issue, I don't feel it is. It seems that in many cases it's more an issue of just not being sufficiently informed. For example, in France, where 72% of their power comes from nuclear energy, there's a widespread misunderstanding about it. 69% of those polled believe that nuclear energy contributes to climate change and emits greenhouse gases, when obviously it doesn't. And about 11% of them believed that coal produced less CO2 than nuclear energy. It led to the conclusion that educating the public would be a vital role in how the technology was reducing carbon output. The new fission reactors that have been developed, SMR, or small modular reactors, offer greater flexibility in size and location, multiple safeguards, and improved power output. Plus, MIT and its partners are getting close to commercially available fusion power. And zero-carbon natural gas plants are, well, exactly what they sound like. They are power plants without the smokestacks. The carbon from burning the natural gas never gets released into the atmosphere. This is also good news for the developing nations. Sub-Saharan Africa has had the greatest shortage of electricity access for its people, with only recent years where expansion of access finally exceeded population growth. But the opportunity here is for them to skip the fossil fuel stage and go directly to solar power, in many places anyway, so that we can add the quality of life improvements that technology brings for them without having to worry about the accompanying carbon output. Well, Alan is having to defend himself with his investor, going on about how there's a long history of making money off of death. Ergo, Encouraging the collapse of Western civilization to line your pockets is okay. He also starts throwing shade on the vaccine, that it's rushed through and unsafe with nasty side effects. If only they'd done something so morally upright as to pretend to be sick and then claiming to be cured. Yeah, Mr. Moral Compass, isn't he? This is all just rationalization, of course, because he then says that he's prepared to tell people not to take the vaccine, provided that he's properly positioned to profit from that act. Except hedge fund guy is working with the authorities. They pick Alan up when he tries to run for it and arrest him for security fraud, conspiracy, manslaughter, and infringing on a DC Comics trademark. It's been decided the vaccine is to be distributed via a national lottery as determined by your birthday. Good news, except Mitch's daughter finds out she's number 144, and she doesn't want to have to wait nearly 5 months before being allowed to go outside. But if you think that's bad, Orontes has been an actual prisoner this whole time. She does seem to be enjoying being a teacher for the kids while they wait for the ransom of a cure. They want 100 doses of the vaccine for the village, or Orontes will never be seen again, so I guess she wasn't that popular of a teacher after all. Actually, seems like she might have had a case of Stockholm Syndrome, because on learning that the doses were placebos, this village wasn't the only one to try this sort of thing, she runs off to presumably tell them. Well, it's a polite thing to do at the very least. Because of the fact that the film features a lot of recognizable faces running in different stories, the film was shot focused upon each storyline first to save money. So the footage in Hong Kong and work related to Orontes was done first, then it was off to Chicago and Cheever's storyline, and so on. Some of their stories were also shot at both the CDC and WHO, when it was explained that the goal wasn't to sensationalize an outbreak, but to try to show a realistic portrayal of it. This is part of what makes this such a fantastic movie. It is uncompromising in its look at the severity of the situation, and it refuses to milk it for cheap drama. The drama is real, but it's an organic drama. There are no acts of cinematic heroism. There are quiet acts of heroism that often go unsung. There are no speeches to stir the audience. There is just straightforward explanation. Contagion feels scary because it feels so real and believable. Okay, well, since we're nearing the end, I suppose it's time to wrap these storylines up. Alan has been demonstrated to have no antibodies present for the disease, definitive proof that he faked being sick, although he's out on bail for right now thanks to his crazy fandom. But this is just buying time. They've got the goods on him, and the government has taken down bigger people with less proof than that. Although we should remember supervillains escape from jail all the time. As for the rest of them, Cheever gives his shot to the son of that janitor to save him having to wait 7 months of being at risk. And Mitch creates a prom night for his daughter at home. Her boyfriend has already gotten his shot, so as you can see, even here, we're getting a happy ending. Sort of. Oh, but we get let in on something no one else does. Seeing a bulldozer topple a tree in the jungle in order to make way for the new factory that prompted Beth's visit to China. This disrupts a colony of bats, one of whom munches on a banana, and then drops that where a pig can get at it. And of course, they're not called pigs for being fussy eaters. The pig is picked up and brought to a restaurant, and earlier we had seen Mitch going through Beth's photos from her trip on her digital camera in order to use it to take pictures of the prom. One of them was of her posing with the chef, holding hands. And we see now that right before that, the chef had been handling the pig with his bare hands and didn't wash them in between. So, I guess the message of the film is this: don't touch foreigners, they're diseased. 2020 has become a punchline, and there has indeed been widespread tragedy this year. We can look back on bad decisions as well as the unforeseeable. And it's easy to give into cynicism when we are bombarded with messages of bad things. But remember, for much of human history, things were worse by orders of magnitude. In some cases, it was happening to us, our ancestors at least. And in other cases, it was happening and we just didn't know. We lived in blissful ignorance. Yet even in ignorance, things got better, didn't they? And bumps in the road, they're actually a signal of how good things have become, if you think about it. The reason for the four horsemen image is because throughout human history, hunger, war, and disease rocked fragile human settlements. They could destroy civilizations. 2020 stood out because rather than destroying civilization, it momentarily disrupted our forward progress. Progress towards a world without hunger and poverty. We're not talking some hippie dream or some science fiction utopia. That's the world that we are helping to build. We may be tempted to lament that we are not angels, but we should take comfort in knowing we strive to be. We have not built utopia, but we've made a pretty good start.